Hello, and welcome to another episode of the American Compass podcast. I'm Drew Holden, managing editor at American Compass, filling in just for this intro for Oren Cass, our chief economist. Today is a fascinating conversation between Oren and Harry Marino, a former MLB minor league baseball player who led the successful effort to unionize the minors last year. He's also the founder and president of Sports Solidarity, which helps athletes and other sports industry workers improve their lives through collective action. He and Oren discuss Marino's experience in the minors, his push for a union to address the terrible living and working conditions of ball players, and where the lessons that he learned are applicable beyond baseball. It's a really insightful discussion, with important takeaways about labor and collective bargaining, both in America's pastime and beyond the world of sports. And also at American Compass, on the Commons, we published a piece yesterday from Fred Bauer titled The Toaster Economy, about what lessons can be drawn about U.S. manufacturing from the story of the humble toaster. And on Thursday, plan for a piece from Batya Ungar-Sargon, breaking down the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And be sure, if you haven't already, to sign up for Oren's Substack, Understanding America, at understandingamerica.substack.com. He's out with new newsletters every Monday and Friday. And with that, enjoy the conversation with Harry Marino.
Harry Marino, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We have all sorts of things in common, I guess, starting with not only having gone to Williams College, but played on the Williams College baseball team. I was the bullpen catcher. You, a few years later, were a star pitcher. So you threw the no-hitter. I was the guy who warmed you up before you threw the no-hitter, which I think is essentially the same thing. But in a
certainly both valuable parts of the team.
That's
Absolutely.
Right. There is no no-hitter without the bullpen catcher warming the pitcher up for the no-hitter. So we share in the credit. But perhaps more importantly for these purposes, we both are very interested in labor law, future of labor law, things wrong with labor law, reform of labor law. And unlike most Compass podcast episodes where I pretty much skip the actual background of the person because I don't care and I just want to get to the the topic. The background and your story through and work on this is in a sense what's important. So I do want to spend some time on it and would love to start by just asking you, how did you end up involved in labor law? Start us at the beginning and tell us a little bit about the journey.
All right, I will. I'm happy to do it. And you can cut me off if it's boring you or if it's going too long. But I'm happy to kind of start at the beginning, which is really for me after I graduated from our alma mater, Williams College. I was signed by the Arizona Diamondbacks to play in their minor league system, and went off to their rookie league team in Arizona thinking, wow, I get to go be a professional baseball player. And I had certain conceptions in my mind of what that was going to be. I knew it wasn't going to be the fame and riches of the major leagues, but I, at the same time thought, okay, I'm going to be a professional athlete. That's going to be a certain lifestyle, a certain way of living. This is what it's going to look like. I got there and I quickly found out it was something very different from that. So my first year in the minor leagues, I made $3,300 for the entire year, which is, we know you can't support yourself on. So
that's not even minimum wage, presumably.
Well below minimum wage because players did not get paid, even though you had to train all year round. You only got paid during the season when games were being played. And it ended up getting challenged later successfully, but teams basically were arguing that they were exempt from minimum wage and hour laws at the time. And so just flagrantly in violation of minimum wage. My second year in the minor leagues, I remember I picked up 5 of my teammates on the way to the field each day. All of them were living together in a 1-bedroom apartment, right? That's what the conditions were like in minor league baseball. Players made less than $10,000 a year, housing insecurity, food insecurity, taking out loans from family members, working 2 and 3 additional jobs on the side of being a professional athlete to make ends meet were all the norm.
And
You know,
are there different tiers? I mean, if you're the first round draft pick, presumably you're doing better than that. But what is the dynamic in which can you go see if another team will pay you more? Are there just more low level minor league prospects than teams, and so you can kind of take it or leave it? How does that work?
yeah, there are a couple different things going on there. Number one is that there are signing bonuses that the top prospects play. So the conditions are the same for all players. The one difference is if you are, say, a first round draft pick or a second, maybe down into the third or fourth round, but not much, past that, you might get a six figure, even for a top pick in the draft, seven figure signing bonus. But the actual condition, so obviously, that changes the dynamic for those top prospects. But for everyone else, and for those players, the conditions are the same because there's a standard uniform player contract that all the players sign. And that goes to the second sort of answer to your question, which is how does this happen or how did it happen at the time? And part of the story here is that baseball has an antitrust exemption. So this anomalous exemption from federal antitrust laws allows teams, these competitors in the industry to collude on the treatment of the players. And that, normally in sports happens because there is a union and collective bargaining. And that's why there's a standard contract. And therefore, the antitrust laws wouldn't apply anyway because of the non statutory labor exemption. In minor league baseball, there was no union and the antitrust exemption. And those two things together created the conditions for those suboptimal working conditions for the players. And so that's really how I even started to become conscious of labor issues, was from my firsthand experience and sitting there saying, okay, the Baltimore Orioles, the Arizona Diamondbacks, these teams that I was playing for in their minor league system, I could look up online how valuable they were, the kind of revenue they were generating. And I looked around and I said, well, why are we sleeping five players to a one bedroom apartment and can't afford food? And right, like I understand maybe that the value isn't there to pay us these huge sums. And I understand that there's a lot of competition for these spots, but at the same time, this just isn't right. And so, you fast forward for me about 6 or 7 years. At the time, I should say, players complained, obviously, like,
Yeah.
go through that and not complain. But no one really thought there was anything that could be done about it. There was no discussion of how do we change this, or it was just kind of accepted as part of the deal.
Yeah, and I guess it's actually a good point that when you talk about sort of the value of the enterprise, the revenues, what other people are getting paid, it's not like a situation where you've got a million entry level employees and the economics of a very small raise become very big very fast. I mean, a given team's farm system would have couple hundred people in it presumably, and so the difference between paying them $3,000 a year and $30,000 a year is presumably some fraction of what one Major League Baseball player is actually earning for the year.
Absolutely. I mean, just a very, very marginal increase, in terms of the bottom line for the employer, which was part of what made it so. And, as we talk, I'm sure we'll get down to sort of what happened later and how we ended up addressing some of these issues. But it became a big part of the conversation when we sat at the table with the league was, look, this cost is minute relative to your overall costs here. It just doesn't make sense in the way, as you say, if there was a million workers, it might be different. Here we're talking about 6,000 minor league players across all 30 teams.
All right, so you're living in this way, picking everyone up on the way to the ballpark. Where do you go from there?
So, like with 9 out of 10 minor league baseball players, I did not make it to the major leagues. I instead went to the University of Virginia for law school after 3 seasons in the minor leagues. I wrote in my law school admissions essay about the treatment of minor league players. It was something that I thought was a good example of people who needed advocates, not at all imagining that might be something in my future, candidly, more just thinking of it as emblematic of the benefits of advocacy, or kind of what's lacking when there aren't advocates for a group of folks. And so after, fast forward, go to UVA for law school, a clerk for a couple of federal judges, was working at a law firm in DC, mostly doing, appellate litigation, really far away from sports at that point. And I was sitting in my office, eating lunch one day, reading an article on ESPN.com, like so many other people, on their lunch hour, and I read about this organization, this nonprofit called Advocates for Minor Leaguers that had been formed to improve the working conditions for minor league players. And I immediately thought back to my playing days, to this law school admissions essay. As I said, it was just this thing that, yeah, I knew it was crazy, but there was nothing that anyone had ever tried to do about it. So it wasn't really something I'd given much more thought to.
Right, and presumably it is not a high share of former minor league baseball players who end up at doing appellate work at elite DC law firms.
Not a huge amount, although funny enough, there were another fellow by the name of Matt Rice was also a former minor league player who was at the same firm, which
Huh.
was kind of funny because we would joke about that there probably weren't a ton of us. But so and look, I'm Catholic. My faith is really important to me, and there was instantly when I read about the organization, I felt almost like it was kind of like my vocation appearing to me before my eyes. Right, it was like a real feeling of being called to go do this thing, kind of at the intersection of my background, my abilities, and so I'm fortunate to have a supportive spouse who encouraged me to leave the firm to go do this crazy thing and join this nonprofit that had no money, literally no funding at the time. And so I did, and uh, left the firm, became the first executive director of this nonprofit, Advocates for Minor Leaguers. And this was, I guess, right, pandemic had just started. It was late 2020, early 2021. And that was when I really jumped into labor advocacy as a full-time job for the first time, and got in there and tried to start to really assess the working conditions, figure out what was going on, and what could we do at that point to try to improve things for the players.
Right. And so this is a great time for our first digression into the wonders of American labor law. It's a nonprofit cannot then show up at the door of major leagues and say, well, I guess you could, hey, let's just work on this. I wonder, actually, I should ask, did you guys try that approach, or did you know from the beginning this is going to have to be an organizing campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, within a week of taking over as the executive director, I received a subpoena from Major League Baseball related to a class action lawsuit, um, having to do with minor league working conditions. And I think that's when I realized how much was at stake for them and what a fight they saw this as, right? That this was so quickly, that they went for the kill, right? Kill it in their cradle. Like, we don't want this thing to get off the ground. Um, you know, really, what I realized is there were two paths that we could go down to improve the conditions, and they relate to the things we've kind of already talked about. One was the antitrust exemption, right? So one way would be we could kind of approach this like just from a lobbying perspective and try to get this, senseless. Lots of it's been written about how baseball's antitrust exemption doesn't make any sense. Like, let's make an attempt to um, get rid of the exemption either through the courts or through Congress, and in so doing, open up competition for
Right.
the
And we should
players.
say,
And,
just
and
to clarify the antitrust exemption, because it's
yeah,
fascinating. There's, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no actual law on this. The courts essentially said, well, it makes no sense to apply antitrust law to a sports league, so we're just not going to do it. Is that
yeah.
about it?
So basically, yeah, the history of baseball's antitrust exemption is fascinating and a subject of a few different really good books, and it has its own crazy history to it. But essentially, yeah, back in 1922, the Supreme Court recognized this exemption for baseball. It subsequently wasn't extended to other sports. It was revisited several times by Congress, who didn't do anything about it, which didn't do anything about it. And since then, there's been this sort of stalemate where Congress kind of calls it a judicially created exemption. and vice versa. The courts say, oh, well, Congress didn't do anything about it, so they must have actually implicitly, given their stamp of approval to it. And so everyone agrees it doesn't make sense. Nobody agrees, or nobody takes responsibility to do anything about it. And so it's persisted for some, 100 odd years at this point. And so that was certainly one of the pathways that we considered right off the bat, was going after that exemption, because so few people would step up and defend the exemption, and because we could so clearly say, hey, this standard contract saying guys get paid $5,000 a year, if the antitrust laws apply, would be struck down. The other path, though, was organizing a labor union, because we knew that the other big difference between minor league baseball players and other professional athletes was that they didn't have a collective bargaining agreement and a union advocating for their interests. And very much from the start, we saw these as two different paths, right? Because once you have collective bargaining, you're not going to sue under the antitrust laws anyway, so the exemption isn't going to matter. So really what we did was kind of try to pursue both at the beginning, and we really built out an organizing team of former players, 5 former players, and brought on an organizing director from the legacy labor movement who had organized unions for some 25, 30 years in other sectors. And we just started talking to players across the country, 6,000 players across 150 teams. At the same time, we began talking to folks on Capitol Hill about baseball's antitrust exemption, and a third prong, which was really related to both of these two pathways, was a tremendous amount of public relations work to try to raise awareness about the conditions of the players, to put pressure on the league, to raise awareness among the folks on Capitol Hill, and to put the wind at the back of the players to begin organizing, and to see that they had people on their side who thought that this wasn't right, and were surprised about the conditions. And so that's really, when I sat down and we started to figure out a plan, those were the kind of pathways, and that's kind of how we started to progress down the path during the 2021 and early 2022 seasons.
And so the organizing path, then the path is so interesting, because I think there are lots of people out there who think about all sorts of industries, and obviously there is very little union density in the private sector. There are these big, as you said, kind of legacy unions that are assumed to be the ones who would organize if one were to organize. You weren't sort of raising your hand to be another, AFL-CIO local. You were starting something new, right? Like this would be an independent union, essentially. And so what is that like? Let's say someone has another place that, like, we should have a union. Once that idea is entered into your head, what comes next? You mentioned you need organizers, you're having conversations. Are you starting to think about an election? What does it mean to become a union out of nothing?
Absolutely. So these are private employees, right? So they're subject to the National Labor Relations Act. Public employees might be subject to those state laws, state labor laws. But under the NLRA, you're basically looking at a pretty straightforward, though not easy, process, which is ultimately to get a majority of the workforce to agree to join the union, right? 50% plus one is kind of the key threshold, the majority on board. And in order to do that, you can basically go out and get union cards signed saying, we want, hey, we're raising our hand, we want to join a union. If you get more than a third of the workforce on board with that, then that triggers an election in which the majority of those who vote decide whether there's going to be a union in that workforce or not. Alternatively, you can get to a majority plus one, right? A majority of 50% plus one, a majority of the workforce on the cards and go to the employer and just ask for voluntary recognition and say, hey, we have the majority, and they can at that point choose to not actually, force you to the election and to say, okay, we'll agree, we'll recognize the union, and now we'll collectively bargain with you. And so in our case with the minor league baseball players, what we realized was it was hard to organize the players because everyone, you can imagine, really just wants to be a Major League Baseball player, right? They're not looking to be a career minor leaguer. And so the risks associated with organizing, which are always there and always present in any workforce, were really, really acute and acutely felt in minor league baseball because most guys were like, well, I do not want to risk my chance of playing for the Baltimore Orioles just to have, slightly better working conditions in Aberdeen in A-ball, right? And so that was always seen as a real barrier to organizing the players. And so from our perspective, what we were able to do was, it took a lot of good organizing and a lot of really explaining the power of the collective and the lack of risk that would be felt by any one player if everyone kind of came in and did this, jumped into the ocean together on this thing. But also we decided at a certain point that it was going to be much, much easier to get out to the full group and get everyone on board if we associated with the Major League Baseball Players Association. Mm-hmm. And that is ultimately the path that we did. And there was a lot of discussion and a lot of strategic, back and forth about whether to just form an independent union or to go a different way. Ultimately, what we decided was to try to do this through the MLBPA. And so what we essentially did was we negotiated a merger really of our organization, where our staff of 10 people from the nonprofit went into the MLBPA to work on bringing in the minor league players and then service, those players. And so create a new bargaining unit within the MLBPA. And so in August of 2022, that's what we did. We negotiated this merger, got the players got the MLBPA to agree to do this, to take this on. And at that point, we had already been organizing for, a couple of years. So we had a really strong base of support. We also, and circling back to this antitrust exemption idea, we had been working for 2 years on lobbying on Capitol Hill around baseball's antitrust exemption and had some success to the point where there were letters of inquiry being written that, I was weighing in, the commissioner, Rob Manfred, was weighing in. There was a hearing scheduled. They were really, revisiting this exemption in the context of the treatment of minor league players. And so when we put out the union cards under the MLBPA umbrella in August of 2022, we were well teed up where these senators, and I should say senators from both sides of the aisle, so Durbin, Blumenthal, Grassley, and Lee were the four that were kind of leading the charge from the Judiciary Committee. They were able to turn to MLB and say, look, if you agree to voluntarily recognize these players, negotiate with them in good faith, we'll pull down this antitrust hearing. And, these are kind of, mutually exclusive paths anyway. So the players want to go that way. We're fine with that. That will address these working conditions, which are the reason why we've been, looking into this in the first place. And so that was really helpful because that was a big part of why I think MLB agreed really quickly once we went to them and said, hey, we put out union cards within 72 hours of sending them out, again, after a couple of years of organizing. And under the MLBPA umbrella, we had a vast majority of players sign those cards, within 3 days. And so then MLB said, all right, we're not going to force you to an election and we're not going to have some, knockdown, drag out fight here. We're actually going to, sit down and bargain with you over a collective bargaining agreement to move the industry forward. And so that's what happened.
Nice. Well, and take your 60 seconds to brag. What was the result? What do minor league baseball players have now that they didn't before?
Well, listen, it's not my bragging. It's really the bragging of all the players who were a part of it, because that was really how we did this. Was we sat at the table with Major League Baseball and we had dozens of players that were a part of the organizing committee that were really heavily involved in the negotiating of the agreement, which was really cool. But yeah, we look over 5 months, we negotiated a 200 plus page CBA that has all kinds of stuff in it. But at its core, I mean, it tripled pay for the players, guaranteed them free housing, meals, transportation, better health benefits, better medical protections, a grievance procedure with just cause provision. So, like a lot of the standard elements of a collective bargaining agreement, and then really just much improved day to day working conditions so that players wouldn't have to go out and work multiple jobs, wouldn't struggle with housing insecurity, food insecurity. Just so much of it was common sense. And as I said earlier, that became a big part of the conversation when we sat down with the league. Was, look, this is actually in your interest as the employer to have athletes that are well fed, that are not sleeping on air mattresses with four other guys in the bedroom, but like are getting a good night's sleep, that can afford to train instead of working construction and driving Uber and all this stuff. And right. And so I think one of the great things about collective bargaining is that conversation happening. I know a lot of people are pretty skeptical of it, right? And think, oh, there's no real conversation between the sides. It's just about power and get, the best you can and whatever, and pass proposals. And my experience with collective bargaining in this context was different, where I felt like from the players' side, we gained an understanding of the economics of minor league baseball and why, realistically, what the teams could invest in this and what made sense for them to invest in, to what extent they could invest in it. And from the league side, I think they gained a much better appreciation for what it's like to be a minor league baseball player on the day to day. And I think they learned a lot about the way that players were experiencing this job and ways that it could be improved. And I think that's why we were able, in large part, to get a really good deal done in a short period of time, is because there was genuine conversation happening, across the table. And we were able to reach just a better outcome for everyone through the collective bargaining process.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it speaks exactly to what I wanted to now ask you about, is like, lessons learned. I mean, there are some ways in which this is the kind of quintessential story of how a union is supposed to work, and there are others in which you could say, well, this is a total outlier, in every respect. What can we learn from it? And so I'm curious, as someone who is now essentially in the labor movement, seeing many different dimensions of it, how in some ways this just has to be different. It's, minor league baseball, you do have the antitrust exemption, but in other ways you could say, well, we could be doing a lot more of this kind of thing. How applicable do you think it is? What do you think is stopping more of this from happening, either from the labor side, the management side, or just the sort of economic conditions generally?
Yeah, so I think that this actually is more applicable to other contexts than I would have thought maybe even a couple of years ago. So I think when I was going through this, as a former player, as someone who's very passionate about the conditions for the players, as someone who didn't come out of the labor movement more generally, I was much more of the mind that our situation was unique, that this was a one-off thing, and that we needed to address it in that spirit and in that way. I think as I've become more acquainted with other contexts, with the labor movement more generally, with other organizing drives across sports and beyond, I think that there actually is a lot more in common with the minor league situation, and other situations than I would have said. And I think the reason that, look, there's like anything, there's good and bad in the American labor movement, right? One of the things that's bad that has, I think, gotten in the way is there's just not a focus on new organizing. Like structurally, they're not focused on new organizing. They largely, right, are focused on protecting their own turf, protecting what they have, serving their current members. And because most new organizing happens through the organizing departments of these existing labor unions that aren't particularly incentivized to add new members, because again, they're funded by member dues. And so current members are mostly thinking, hey, use my member dues to support me, right? Not to necessarily add another unit of workers. There's just the incentives aren't really lined up right. And so it's not a coincidence that this organizing drive started from the outside, right? Advocates for minor leaguers was an outside entity with the goal of organizing these players. Now,
Yeah, well, right. I mean, that's a great point. This question had been running through my mind. Wait a minute, there is an MLBPA. Why on earth hadn't they done this? Everybody in it had gone through this themselves. But to your point, once you are the major leaguer and you're an organization representing major leaguers, it's not really likely to be certainly a financial priority for you.
absolutely. And I think the fact that it didn't even happen in that context, where, as you said, all of the members came through this other unit, speaks to how challenging it is to get folks to invest in new organizing as members themselves. And look, the reality is they want to see, hey, what's my dues money going to and how does it benefit me? It's coming out of my paycheck, right? So it makes sense. And while we could say, hey, it's the more members you add, you're going to build power. It's the right thing to do. All of those kinds of sort of more abstract or principled reasons to do it. The economics of it are they're not particularly incentivized to do it. And so to me, and this goes into kind of what I'm working on now through sports solidarity, which I'm sure we can talk about, but I think that new organizing has to fundamentally start at scale, at least outside of the existing labor unions. And so to me, that's what we can take from what we did, and I think apply more broadly is say, yes, ultimately, when push comes to shove, it will be very beneficial, as it was for us, to have the legacy labor unions invite new members in, work with new members, be willing to take that step. But on some level, a lot of this new organizing has to come from outside, because just waiting for dues money from existing union members to spur all new organizing is going to fall short, just as it had fallen short for minor league players for 60 years while the major league players had a powerful union, and they never looked once to organize the minor league players. And candidly, I don't think if advocates for minor leaguers had done it as much as there are people at the staff level and people, major league players who are happy to have the minor leaguers, I don't think it ever would have happened without this outside entity coming in and pushing it to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the flip side is there's a real bootstrapping problem. If you're relying on new organizing, it doesn't have a base of dues to start from. What do you think that looks like if you were advising someone who is saying, "Hey, look, I'm we take a I worked in the hotel industry for a number of years in this city. I really think there's an opportunity here. What would it take, and what, if any, sort of supports would it be especially helpful to have out there in that kind
Yeah.
of
So
situation?"
look. So this is really what sort of the fundamental question and problem that I see, us trying to solve at Sports Solidarity in the context of sports, albeit with very much with the view that it can be then sort of replicated and extended beyond sports, which is how do we bring capital to bear on this problem? How do we actually bring resources to organizing? And so what we're really sort of working on and puzzling through and I think sort of making some exciting, innovative, developments on at this point is how do we take potentially foundation money, dues money from existing unions, and investment capital? What's the right mix? How do we get folks to bring money to this so that we can start to actually create new organizing? And it's something, candidly, that hasn't really been done before. I mean, there's been people who have talked about this, right? That we need to, on a very fundamental level, you can just look at something like 7 in 10 American workers say they would join a union if presented the opportunity, and only 1 in 10 are in a union. And any business-minded person could say, okay, look at that gap. Like there's something to be done there, right? There's some inefficiency there and something needs to be created to bridge that gap between the 7 and the 1.
Yeah.
In some level, that's kind of what I see us as taking on now, is how do we think about solving that gap between the 7 who would and the 1 who are. And we can't just sit around and wait for the legacy labor movement to use dues money to do all the new organizing. That has to be part of the equation, and they might be really good long-term homes for the workers because all of the structures are already in place. There's a lot of things to recommend, them in that regard. So they're important, integral, maybe the most important partners in this, but they can't be relied on as, as the folks who are going to get this off the ground or who are going to really solve this problem, because, as history shows us, that just hasn't happened. And so that being said, there are foundations, and we're talking to them, who are interested in the future of work, helping workers, who are trying to figure out how do we help solve this problem. And then at the same time, there are also, there's private capital that's also interested in this, not only from sort of a social perspective, but also, hey, from a very business-minded perspective, right? Like, those folks who aren't organized stand to gain financially if they do organize, as the minor league players did. They tripled their pay. There's got to be something there, right? Like, let's figure out, right? If we can figure that out, how do we invest in this, right? There's got to be some, even if it's not a huge return, unless it's like really scaled, the dynamics are such that there's an inefficiency here, there's a gap here, and if we can figure that out, there's some level of a business opportunity. And so that's kind of the project right now, is how does this all fit together? How do we take the dues money? How do we take the donor and foundation money? How do we take some, business money, investment money, and bring it to new organizing to spur some of this stuff from the outside?
Yeah. So the point about the legacy union is potentially being the right homes for these things, sort of once they're stood up. It's almost, you think about all the the startup drug companies that then get bought by the 4 pharma majors, or all the Silicon Valley companies. The goal is to get Google to buy you, in a sense. Um, it seems to me that does raise the question, though, of what about everything that works so poorly in the existing labor movement. And I think everyone will have different views about everything that is good and bad about the union experience, both for workers and for management and companies and the economy generally. But I think it's safe to say it hasn't been going great. And so I guess sort of last thing I'd ask you about is, either if you were thinking about things that would ideally change in the legacy movement, or just as you're thinking about, as you're standing up new entities, how can they behave differently, either as independents or if they, do ultimately get sort of rolled up in a way. What do you think are the keys there? And maybe there's a sort of legislative element. Maybe it's just how you structure the organization or how it operates. What can labor be doing better than it has been?
I mean, a lot is the truth, right? I think that there are a few things that stand out to me. I mean, one goes back to collective bargaining. So, unions done right are great. Collective bargaining done right is great. It's not always done right, neither of them, right? And what I mean by that is, I think with collective bargaining, so often what you see is more, and on both sides, right, about brinksmanship, ego, competition, deeply personal, greed, all of these things, instead of approaching it in a more rational manner, right? Which is to say, this is an efficient way to reach a fair deal across the entire industry, rather than doing this on a case by case basis. We can do this for the whole group at once, and we can get all of our collective wisdom in the room and figure out something that really makes sense and address these problems together. That's collective bargaining, in my opinion, done right. And it's not fundamentally about strikes and lockouts and work stoppages, which are bad for everyone. It's about, this is an efficient way to do this. And no doubt, employers who don't want to, pay workers a fair share are a big, I'm not going to sit here and say I don't think that's a big part of why that's not how it's done. But I also think from the labor movement, there's not necessarily, whatever, chicken and the egg, but there's not necessarily an orientation towards collective bargaining in that grow the pie for everyone kind of a way, right? So I think that's like one piece, is just how to think about collective bargaining and what it is as an enterprise. And then, look, unions, and this goes back to the idea of not spending money on new organizing. It's no secret that unions spend a lot of money on political spending, right? And largely, again, not a surprise here, largely in support of one party over the other. And to me, that's also a bit of a mistake. And look, I completely understand why that's the case and why it's the way that it's happened. But to me, unions and worker power should not be partisan issues, in my opinion, right? Like, this should be, workers make up the vast majority of the citizenry. Like, what's good for workers should be a priority for anyone involved in politics. And from the union side, again, while I can understand completely why it's happened, and unions do not bear sole or maybe even primary responsibility for it, they bear some responsibility for going down a road that's far, in my opinion, too partisan, right? And so I think that there's an opportunity to sort of reconceptualize what unions should be without them taking on different forms. I think these are cultural things. These are things that can be done by leaders, right? And I think one of the ways to reshape the way that unions operate and the way they think about what they're engaged in is to put new members into them, right? To say, okay, these are new members who are coming in with a different vantage point, who are not necessarily only going to do things the way things have been done before. So I think structurally, I'm pretty optimistic about the power of unions to solve a lot of the problems in our economy today. I'm not Pollyannish about the gap, about how that gets done, and the gap between where we are today and that ultimately happening. But I think that new organizing, putting new members in, and sort of embracing some different ideas about what unions can and should be, I think there's a lot of promise there. And so, and that's not to say, I think despite their deficiencies in some ways, I think unions are doing a lot of things right at the same time already. And so I think, from my perspective, one thing that it's important to say is there's also, beyond the economic outcomes and efficient outcomes and all of that, I think there's power in, and I saw this in the minor league player case very acutely, there is power in having a voice on the job, in feeling like you belong to a collective group to which you owe responsibilities, you have some level of ownership and autonomy over your daily life at work. Like, that's really a good thing, I think. And I saw the way that it impacted the players, and they thought, differently about themselves, about the job. And it was really powerful. And I think you also learn in a really tangible way what democracy is supposed to look like, in a way that can feel really far off when you think about national level electoral politics. You can feel it really acutely in a union of, hey, we're voting on this proposal. Like, what the majority says is going to go. This is, I think there's really powerful things that I, from outside of the union world, wouldn't have necessarily appreciated, that I don't think we should overlook as we look to the future of labor unions and the role they can have in our economy and our society and democracy more generally.
That is an incredible place to leave it. I have nothing to add, so I will simply thank you so much for the work you've done, for making the time to be with us, and for whatever it is you are taking on next.
Thanks, Oren. Appreciate you having me on.
This has been yet another episode of the American Compass podcast, and we will be back again next week with another exciting conversation.